Mic down a little bit? Yeah. It is super loud. Yeah, that's better. Okay, welcome Karen and Allison. Thanks for joining us tonight. We'll be getting started here shortly.
Testing 1, 2, 3. Guys hear me okay? Great.
Okay, John, we've reached the witching hour. Let's go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone.
Yeah, welcome everybody to Buddhism in a Nutshell. My name is John Castello. I'll be your instructor for the next, so tonight and 4 more Tuesday evenings. So So I wrote up our agenda here. Before we start on that, I just wanted to cover some basics here, logistics. So there's a book, this green one here, Buddhism in a Nutshell, the same title as this course. If you'd like to check that out, we have copies in the bookstore there. And there's also an online course made by FPMT, which is the parent organization of Kadampa Center. And that actually, I checked on that. That is available to take for $5. And for $5, you can get a PDF version of this book and also some recordings of teachings by Venerable Amy Miller, who has taught at this center a few times before. Some of you might recognize that name. And also some extra things in that course, like some questions for reflection and things like that. So for $5, that's a nice way to go ahead and get the PDF of the book if you'd like, and to access some of the same material we're covering. All right, so let's start out by some introductions, I guess. I'd love to get to know you guys a little bit. I guess I'll start us off here. So John Castello, and I've been here for about 23 years, I think. So like back in 2003, I guess I started becoming interested in Buddhism mid 90s somewhere. But oddly enough, in 2003, three different people in three different places around the triangle told me about there was this spunky Buddhist nun coming to Raleigh next week. And I see a couple of you laughing. You probably know who I'm talking about. Yeah, so Venerable Rabina Corton was teaching that day. And right from the start, it just kind of sounded familiar as soon as she started talking. So I was kind of hooked from day one there, and started coming to classes here, and here I am 23 years later. So would anybody else want to introduce yourself, just simply your name, and either talk about what inspired you to check out Buddhism or the Kadampa Center in general, or maybe this class in particular? So anybody want to start?
I'll go next. I'm
Okay.
Lisa, volunteer coordinator here. I came across Buddhism about 2010. I was in therapy, and my psychologist actually recommended meditation to me, which was a good thing, turned out. So one of my first experiences, however, was with Venerable Rabina, and I too just kind of latched on to her and the teachings, and became really interested in it. So yeah, it's good path.
All right. Thanks, Lisa. Anyone else?
Hi, my name is Ben.
Oh, let's get a mic, please. Yeah. And you
Uh,
can go next.
The mic allows people on Zoom and on YouTube to hear everyone.
Good evening. My name's Paul Wary. I also came to Buddhism. I was in therapy and my therapist recommended meditation. And I went to a Buddhism class in Winston-Salem. And I love the message and the people. And that started, I guess, in 2022. And I've been on and off a little bit, but hopefully I'll be here a lot. But I enjoy everything about it. Thank you.
Thanks, Paul.
Hi, I'm Katie. I also found out about all of this through therapy, I guess. I've been meditating on my own for many years. I'm a big fan of mindfulness, and I was just looking for more people to meditate with, just like people who enjoy it and find benefit from it. And I have found that Buddhism is really working for me. So, yeah.
Okay, great. And Katie, you said your name was right. Okay. Thank you. And anybody online, feel free to jump in. And Lisa, I think.
Hi.
Yeah.
So I'm actually from Austria, and my mom studied Buddhism at my age, at that age I am now. She was Catholic and Buddhist, and she brought a lot of that to me, and I've read a lot over the years. But I just I came across the Kadampa Center through another Buddhist center near me, and I started with meditation on weekday mornings and Sunday mornings, and so I'm here now to learn more.
Okay, welcome. I don't know if I caught your name at the beginning, but is it Karen? I'm cheating on
Karen,
the
yes,
Zoom. So. Okay. Yeah.
Karen.
Thanks, Karen.
Hey, I'm Chris. I guess therapy is the theme of this. I've found it through therapy. My therapist suggested Triangle Refuge Recovery, which is hosted here on Fridays. And so I started coming here on Fridays and started looking on the website. And now I'm doing the I'm doing the meditations almost every day of the week, the morning ones. And yeah, just I like what Buddhism, what it's about, the ending suffering and all that. And meditation's really been helping. So I want to get deeper into it. So thank you.
Okay. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Pat. Started coming here in September of last year. I probably could have used therapy before I came, but I was in a state where my mind was just spiraling downwards, and started researching meditations and come across the Kadampa Center. So I started coming, realized that there was about Buddhism as well, and started coming to the teachings on Sundays and realized this is the path I want to follow. So I've been here ever since.
All right. Thank you.
My name is CJ. I started getting interested in Buddhism as a teenager. I kind of, had my existential crisis and started, really doubting the tradition that I'd been brought up in. And I was attracted to Buddhism because it just kind of made sense. Like it was a logical thing that all of the pieces fit together, and it seemed just like well reasoned, kind of nice structure and everything. And so I really was attracted to that. I did not start coming into the center until 2015. But I have been here ever since then. Really, really enjoy the community here.
All right. Thank you, CJ. Anyone else? Anyone online? Oh, I see somebody raising a hand. Feel free to unmute. Jennifer, is that you?
Hi, my name is Jennifer, and I've been interested in meditation and Buddhism for many years. And as a mental health counselor, I find it pairs well for my own mental and spiritual health, but also aligns really tightly with so many approaches that I use, in my office with folks, and can pass forward some of the teachings as well as part of the intervention. Yeah. So this is part of my own personal practice, trying to show up once a week for this.
All right. Thank you, Jennifer.
And I'm Mark, and I guess I started that I know of. I started somewhat studying Buddhism in my teenage years when a group of us used to get together and read the Tibetan Book of the Dead. And some of the kids that I hung out with, their parents were students of Lama Yeshe and Lama Zopa. So then I was also recommended by a therapist to start learning meditation, and went through the Human Kindness Foundation, and which is in Durham. And through them, most of my questions seem to be more along the lines of Buddhist philosophy. So they kind of sent me to correspond with Zen Mountain Monastery in New York. And then through the Liberation Prison Project, I started learning meditation, and they would bring, Herb Cunningham would bring teachings in. And I also met Venerable Rubina during that time. And then I've been interested in it ever since, and have gained a lot of knowledge and some wisdom into how my mind works, and at least I understand it better than I did beforehand.
All right, thank you, Mark.
And hi, everyone. I'm back here doing AV, and this is Linda Sa talking. And I'm spiritual program coordinator here. I won't be here every week for this class, but Chris, our AV guru, who's usually here, is in Las Vegas. Maybe seeing the Canes, I'm not sure. Uh, so anyway, if you have any questions whatsoever, though, just let me know. And Lisa, who is the program manager, she can help as well. And of course, John and CJ is also full of information. And I came to Kadampa Center, I don't remember how long ago it was, probably 25 years ago, but it was on and off, and raised a couple of kids through that, and coordinated the children's program here when it was large and thriving. And now here I am. Anyone else in the Gampa? We got a couple people back here. Y'all want to say hello and what brought you?
It's of course optional.
Option.
If you don't feel like talking, that's fine.
And anyone else online? We've heard from Jennifer and Karen. Anyone else?
Allison,
Hey,
you're unmuted.
this is Allison and Chase, and husband and wife here. I want to say I'm a bit of a contrarian when I come to you in this and say that I found the Tao Te Ching very early on, and as I get deeper into that, I've often looked at Buddhism as the next step, but I struggle with that because of the contradictions that I find, and I just keep searching, keep trying to make those, keep trying to parlay those two things together. Uh, and I just try to look for the information where I can do that. And I even look at the Eightfold Path and the way that I've looked at that over a number of years, and how that can be in contrast to some of the things that the Tao Te Ching says. And I just want to rectify those things and try to find a little bit of peace there, you know?
Great. Yeah, thank you, Allison. And Jason, yes. Mhm. Okay, anybody else? Okay, well, feel free to chime in later if you change your mind. I guess some basic logistics. There's a restroom right outside. If you go out the door and turn left, there are the two restrooms right there. So feel free to get up at any time, stretch. It doesn't have to be an official break, although we will take a break about halfway through, so about 8 o'clock or so. And it's perfectly fine if you want to leave early. The scheduled end time is 9 o'clock, but we might not go that far. If we end up covering the material and we all solved our questions, then we can go home early. That's perfectly fine as well. You're welcome to stay afterwards if that's the case. I'd be happy to stick around and have some more conversations. And just a reminder of where we are in the course. This is the very first in this series. It's the next tonight and then 4 more Tuesday evenings. And Buddhism in a nutshell. And it covers roughly the same material as the Discovering Buddhism series, if you're familiar with that here. That often happens on Monday nights. Except in one 5-week stint, we're going to cover about the same material that Discovering Buddhism covers over a year and a half, 2 years or so. So we're definitely going to get more of an overview. We're going to hit on every topic. And if you want to learn more, you know where to go after that. You can hop into Discovering Buddhism. And I believe we're having Introduction to Mindfulness afterwards. Is that right too? And Linda will be teaching that. So that we'll have a 1-week break after this course ends, and then Introduction to Mindfulness after that. So, okay. So maybe we can pause for just a moment to do what's called a motivation. That's a very traditional way to start any Dharma practice. And we haven't really found out what Buddhism is yet, but when we're doing this thing, whatever it is, it's useful to check in with why we're doing it. Like, I think we did a great job in the introductions of each of us kind of did that already, but maybe we can just have sort of a moment to recall what your reasons are. And I think traditionally this is done sort of where we're closing our eyes and being silent, but we can wait until we learn how to meditate before we do that. So I think just sort of conversationally is fine. And regardless of what your reasons are, another tradition is to challenge ourselves to expand that if we can. And we like to expand that to, well, if we don't already include it, we want to be happy ourselves. So if that's not part of it, add that to your list as well, reasons to be here. And we can then expand it from there to be a benefit to others. And the biggest possible motivation that they talk about in the teachings is wishing for the happiness of everybody and connecting yourself to that by thinking, well, I really want to get my act together, achieve my peace of mind myself so I can be in the best possible position to help other people. So if you want to practice having that as a motivation during this course, that's what the teachings would recommend going for. Okay. Well, a couple days ago, I was listening to NPR, and you guys listen to that show, Wait, Wait, Don't Tell Me? That's the game show that they have on Sundays. I love that show. And they had a segment where they presented 3 stories, and the people were supposed to guess which one is the one that's actually true. And the one that turned out to be true was about DEET, the insecticide for mosquitoes. And if you haven't heard of DEET before, it's a long chemical name, N,N-diethylmetatoluamide, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. And it's an insect repellent. It sounds kind of scary, and it sounds like it would be kind of harmful. But the good news there is that it's actually quite harmless. And the way in which it works is to confuse the mosquitoes by masking the scent of its food, which is us, or the food they're looking for. And apparently they mask the scent of like the carbon dioxide and the sweat and things like that. And in that confusion, they just don't find us. But the news story that they talked about a couple days ago was that recent studies have actually found out that that isn't the whole story, that actually it's been found that mosquitoes can be attracted to DEET. And the reason being that they have actually learned through repetition and observation to associate like, well, where there's DEET, there's food. So just being exposed to DEET can actually incline them to be even more likely to come and visit you. And I really like that. I think it demonstrates a lot of great Buddhist principles just right there in that one story. First of all, like questioning our assumptions. I really thought DEET was kind of a dangerous chemical that, especially if you name out that chemical name, it almost just kind of sounds like it has to be bad for us if the name is that. I was happy to see that. Of course, if you take a big bottle and drink it, I'm sure it could be harmful, but like anything in life. But that sort of reminded me too, getting into what is Buddhism. I think the Buddha would say that, well, I guess maybe I'm skipping ahead to who is the Buddha, but the situation, I guess, that Buddhism would address in our lives is that we often have misconceptions like this about DEET, thinking that DEET is about repelling the insects. Well, most of the time it probably still is, but we probably didn't think about the other possibility. And the Buddhist teachings assert that that's actually the cause of our suffering, the extent to which we have those misconceptions. And not only that, but the Buddha would even dare to say that it's really the only or the root cause of our suffering, in the sense that we can look around us and point at things that we can identify as what's making us suffer today. And it's certainly true that those things could be conditions. It's perfectly valid. So they can be causes as well. But the Buddhist teachings would assert that that's not actually the root cause. whereas the root cause is really just our misconceptions themselves and the extent to which we're not in touch with reality. And the word that they might use for that is ignorance. And so the Buddhist teachings assert that no matter what the suffering is, you can sort of trace it through the things that you can see, the things that you can't see, the things that you might remember from the past, which people are involved, which things are involved. But ultimately, it'll come down to just having a mistaken view of things. And if we can address that problem at the root, then the rest will sort of work itself out. So, and Buddhism does tend to talk about suffering a lot, and it might seem a little morbid or depressing or something like that. And we'll get to that in Buddha's first teaching. He addresses that topic there. But there's also some good news there in the sense that if the problem isn't actually out there and something we can point to and identify, it turns out the problem is actually under our control and something that we can solve just with our mind. Like the solutions are right there. We don't need to grab anything from the outside, any particular concepts to do it. And of course, we could use some help. We've all been at this a long time, making these mistakes. And join the club. I'm not trying to say it's just some people, all of us are making all sorts of mistakes all the time, according to these Buddhist teachings. And some of them are very subtle, and it's very difficult to become aware of. And Buddhism would also assert that the most subtle ones are the ones that are sort of at the root and that really cause us the most suffering, but are the most difficult to really see. And we'll also get in the Buddha's first teaching sort of what that's about. And the Buddha is kind of daring about this. So the teachings sort of move on from there. Like not only can we solve the problem ourselves in our minds, of course, with help from others. Others are definitely involved, and teachers play a really important role. Because if we've been at this for a while, trying things over and over again, you know, if it's anything like, you know, learning piano or a sport or something like that, the best way to try to get better at that is to find a teacher or a coach. And Buddhism is really no different, except this case, instead of a sport or an art, it's being happy and developing the peace of mind that will help yourself be happy and also make you pleasant for others to be around, pleasant to be around others, that is. And so it not only helps lead to our own happiness, but it can lead to being more beneficial to others as well. So not only can we work on that ourselves, but all the suffering, as I said, can be traced back to that. We don't need to worry about the things on the outside so much. And one step more is that all of us can actually eventually eliminate the root of suffering, that we all have that capacity. And I think it's amazing that it's possible at all. But the Buddha would say that not only that, but we all have the potential to do it and the ability to do it, the skills. We just haven't developed them yet, and we're not in touch with them yet. We haven't practiced them yet enough. So, and then on top of that, if we can get to the root of our own suffering, then we'll be in a perfect position to help others do the same thing. And that's ultimately, in the long term, how we can all help each other, is as we achieve our own happiness, we can turn our attention to help others do the same thing. So that's the good news. So if we think about suffering, that kind of starts the conversation. But I kind of like going straight to that part, that we can completely overcome it according to these Buddhist teachings. And should you take my word for that or the Buddha's word for that? Nope. So the Buddha actually says in his teachings that he says you really should never believe anything that he says just on face value. That he encourages people to think about it, compare it against your own experience, see if it makes sense. If it doesn't, that's fine. The Buddha won't be offended. So the Buddha is just simply talking about what he or she himself has observed in their own practice, and just kind of sharing the technique, you know, talking about what they've learned if we're interested in hearing about it. So just remember all the time, nobody's expected to believe anything, and you can be a Buddhist without believing any of the things. And I think when it comes down to it, I would sort of define a Buddhist as someone who's working on their mind and having this goal in mind of overcoming suffering, becoming happy, being a benefit to others, helping other people's happiness, those types of things. And if you're in a fancy place like this with all these cool, colorful pictures around us, and you might see monks and nuns wearing the robes, shaving their heads. There's a nice altar up here, lots of teachings, as it turns out, around the outside. We'll talk a little bit more about those soon. But all of these things that you can see are not really part of the practical definition of Buddhism. It's definitely part of the tradition. And there's a purpose to every single one of these paintings that you see around you. Like the colors mean something, the gestures, that the figures in the paintings, they all mean something too. But ultimately, it boils down to working on your mind. And so from our introductions at the beginning of this, it sounds like we're all in great shape because we were inspired by therapy to come here. So guess what? We're going to be doing therapy with our mind here too. And in fact, Lama Yeshe, who Mark mentioned Lama Yeshe, and his picture is up here, the leftmost maroon frame here. And then the Dalai Lama is hiding behind Lama Atisha's head next to him. And on the far right there is Lama Zopa Rinpoche, who's Lama Yeshe's student. And Lama Yeshe and Lama Zopa Rinpoche are the two people who founded the parent organization of this center, by the way. So that's sort of part of our lineage. Another thing, you may have seen the word up there. We're going to talk about that a little bit as well. So they're definitely a part of the history of this center and a lot of other centers around the world that are like this. So anyway, I was talking about Lama Yeshe. I brought him up because one of the first books that they wrote from his teachings, like some of the earliest teachings that he gave, is called Becoming Your Own Therapist. So if you're among apparently the minority in the room here who hasn't come here from therapy, then here's your chance to do it. And you don't need to find any of us in the room qualified, that, as the title of that book implies, becoming your own therapist, or Buddhism is about teaching you how to sort of do the job yourself. And the catch is, unfortunately, you need to do the job yourself. So if the Buddha could just sort of, wave a magic wand or say just the right words and, use some magic or whatever to make you happy, he probably would have done that by now. So, but then again, the flip side is there's good news there that the Buddha can still help a lot if you practice the teachings, and we can all help each other. And next Tuesday, we're going to talk more about that, sort of the ways in which we really do help each other and what are the resources that we have. Okay, so. Oh, so maybe we might ask the question, we talked about seeing things inaccurately, having misconceptions. So I'm curious, maybe I'll ask the question to you guys. What do you think are maybe some of the important parts, the important things that we get wrong? Like, what are the mistakes that we make that kind of make us our own enemy sometimes, or become the biggest obstacles? Anybody want to? Well, you could talk about it for yourself if you want to mention which things you yourself have figured out that you made mistakes with and realized how much suffering it caused you. Or maybe just hypothetically, anybody want to take a guess what these things are? Oh, and if you wouldn't mind waiting for the mic, then the people online can hear us. Thank you. Yeah, and I guess I forgot to say that, but feel free to jump in with a question at any time. So I will take a break occasionally to ask if there are any questions, but feel free to raise your hand online, virtually, or here physically. So please go ahead.
For me, it's just like living in the past still and thinking about all the mistakes I've made, and also thinking about my future and fear of that with the unknowing. And just from the limited things I've read, it's, with mindfulness, it's kind of like forgiving yourself and, not the future you can't predict. So, just living in the present. So for me, it's a lot of anxiety and from the past and the future. So
Yeah, that's great. Katie.
Yeah, I have a really specific example. I had a really crazy day at work today, and I made a really big mistake. And it was an honest mistake, but I made a big mistake. And the whole drive out here, I live like 40 minutes away, was just these escalating thoughts of something bad is going to happen, something bad might happen to me or to the people that I work with, and just constantly reminding myself of, well, I don't know those things. And I know that the people I work with are really wonderful. And like there are things that I do know around me to be true, but my mind is still making up and looking for things to like be afraid of. So it's just kind of funny that a very real example of that happened to me today, I think.
Yeah, thanks for sharing. Anyone else? Okay.
So I'll say, if you've been to any of the teachings by Geshe Gelik, one of our resident monks, he talks about the blame game, like it's something out here, rather than inside of us. So it's such and such's fault, or that person's fault, or this thing that happened to me, and I stumble over that quite a bit. And then I have to remind myself that I need to kind of reframe that.
Thank you, Linda. Okay, so maybe I'll share one of the things that tends to come up a lot in the Buddhist teachings as an example, but I think you guys have already hit on some great ones, definitely in the top 10. Thinking about the past and future. Yes, I hear you on that one. So, and our culture definitely has a phrase for that. I think, being in the present moment. So Buddhism definitely agrees that that's a good thing to strive for. And exactly like you explained, because, thinking about the past or the future does just tend by its nature to, bring up regret about the past and fear for the future. And just, it's kind of where our minds tend to go sometimes. It sounds like you, and thank you for sharing your specific example of that. So yeah, it does happen. And the blame game, that came up too, Linda. So yeah, looking out there, figuring out whose fault it is. And we mentioned, a few of us mentioned Venerable Rabina earlier as a teacher that we like seeing. And when she talks about her life history, she talks about sort of becoming a radical political activist, kind of going through different phases where she thought that men were the problem, and then that racists were the problem, and then, kept on going through different sets of people that were allegedly the problem. And she said that one day she realized she ran out of people. Like she'd gone through everybody, and so far nobody turned out to be the problem. Like she still found the problem after accounting for everybody. So, and the Buddha would say that the deepest misunderstanding that we have, or tends to have, we're all different, of course, but it tends to happen that the deepest misunderstanding that we have is, maybe a way of saying it is that we underestimate interdependence. Like we sort of get this feeling that we exist from our own side inherently by ourselves, that there's this thing called me that you can sort of separate from others. And it's not just people, it's things too, like all the things around us are related. And one of the ways that Buddhism uses to start thinking about that is thinking back through the past. And one of the concepts in Buddhism is reincarnation. You may have heard that's sort of one of the things talked about in Buddhism. It's not just Buddhism. It turns out, I think, that actually the majority of the cultures in the world do sort of talk about reincarnation and think it sounds like a reasonable thing. And we tend to have a very skeptical and sometimes pessimistic view of that concept in the West. I guess there's a whole history for that. Which is perfectly fine if you don't like the idea of reincarnation, by the way. Remember what I said is if there's anything in the Buddhist teachings you don't agree with, or that makes you feel uncomfortable or anything like that, perfectly fine. I think the best thing to do in those situations is to set those things aside and try to resist the temptation to just kind of reject it out of hand. Because one of the things that tends to happen when we apparently are carrying around this big bag of mistakes with us is that we find out that we're wrong about something. And that certainly happened with me. I think I've been here long enough in these 23 years. I definitely think I've discovered that I'm wrong about things I wouldn't have anticipated I was wrong about. Like there's no way before I came here I'd be like, oh no, nobody's ever going to disprove that thing that I think. So, but it happens. So that's why it's a good habit just to not sort of reject something 100%. Because even if you just leave that little 1% there and put it on the shelf, you can always return to it later. And at least in my experience, I found that was really the only way I could do it sometimes. Like there were just a lot of things I couldn't take head on. No way. I thought I had a mountain of evidence built up against it. But sometimes, you know, it might surprise you. Like one day you just kind of find yourself being a little more gentle with the idea of that thing that you thought was totally bogus. And I think it's nice to be inspired by people here too. Like I've learned a lot from just hearing people talk about their own experience here. And I start to notice things like, well, the people who think about it this way, or at the very least take this as a hypothesis, sort of have as an exercise to take this as their worldview, those people tend to do well. Like I see those people become happier. And the people that I know, like Geshe Gelik has studied this his whole life. You know, he got the equivalent of like a PhD squared practically in Buddhism, growing up at the monastery. It's however many, 25 years or something like that. You know, we think our education is long enough, but it's 25 years over there. So I like the fact that personally, I look at Geshe, I see his smile, I hear his laugh. I see how he inspires people. So I'm sort of curious about why that happened. Like, why did he end up like that? Why is he feeling that way? Why is that part of his personality? And some of the stories he tells us seem like he wasn't always that way. He wasn't just born that way. You know, he had plenty of mistakes just like the rest of us, but he talks about how, you know, what his personal path was in overcoming them. So anyway, I kind of got off on a tangent there, but the main point about that is that the deepest mistake, and one that Buddhism says is the toughest, is kind of, you might have heard the word emptiness or no self, or that there's some phrases around this that kind of sound very confusing, I think. Probably because the concept itself is confusing. It's hard to find the right word for it. But Buddhism would talk about it's basically the concept of thinking of ourselves as more separate than we really are from other people. So, and we're going to talk more about that when we get to the Buddhist first teaching, which is called the Four Noble Truths, by the way. So I hesitated to put Four Noble Truths up there on the board. So personally, I kind of like to start with more understandable terminology. So I found it kind of intimidating sometimes when I came here and I just heard people talk about these things like, oh, the Four Noble Truths, samsara, nirvana, karma, and I didn't really know what they were yet. So I'll do my best to try to introduce things. And if you catch me using a word that you're not sure what that means, call me on it. So feel free to interrupt me. Okay. So maybe a short timeline here. So we've covered Buddhism. I thought maybe we can cover the concept of a nutshell, since that's in the title of this course. So the oldest thing here, I made a little list, and turns out in 750 BCE, so that's like almost 3,000 years ago, I think, if I'm doing my math right. That's when Homer wrote the Iliad. And I'll get back to that in a moment, but I just wanted to mark that there as the oldest thing. And 550 BC, so 200 years after the Iliad, the historical Buddha, the one we refer to as the Buddha when we use that phrase, whose name was Shakyamuni Buddha, was born in about 550 BC. I think 563 might be the exact year if I remember right, but about 200 years after the Iliad was written, that's when the historical Buddha was born. And the first recorded instance of the phrase "in a nutshell" being catching on in a culture was about 600 years later after the Buddha was born, in about 75 AD. And that person was referring back to the Iliad and apparently telling a story about someone who had such great vision and such perfect writing style and could write in such small fonts that that person allegedly wrote the entire Iliad and put it in a nutshell, like a walnut, I think it was. So that was the story at the time, and somehow, I guess it was long before memes, but it became a meme, whatever the equivalent of a meme was in 75 AD. But that wasn't really the same meaning as we use it with today. In fact, in a way, I think it might be the opposite. So, you know, they're still cramming all those details into that nutshell, whereas we're sort of looking to, you know, sort of summarize things and condense things down into, you know, a simpler conversation. And the time at which I think that occurred, I cheated. I researched this in Wikipedia and Google before I came here, but one of the most common points in time at which the same meaning of "in a nutshell" came about was in about 1800 AD. So that's 1700 years after the first recorded use of the term. And that was somebody referring to, or he was reviewing a play in London and mentioned that one thing he likes about the play is that everyone kind of knows the underlying history and it lies in a nutshell. So that history just lies in a nutshell there, sort of, you know, it's simple enough to fit inside that nutshell. And here we are, 300 years after that, they're using it as a course title. So, and when I thought some more about the nutshell, I also remembered another teaching that Venerable Rabina gave about an acorn. And I don't know if some of you might have heard this before, but she sort of compares an acorn to, let's suppose we're acorns and bopping around as an acorn, sort of bouncing around. We fell from a tree at some point, wondering like, well, what's the meaning of life? We might look in the mirror, see ourselves with this hard shell. All the acorns around us kind of look like us. And if it still has that, like acorn has like a thing on top. So maybe they look in that mirror, they see it's a nice hat. Maybe adjust it, polish their shell. But maybe at some point someone comes along and says, oh, wait, actually, did you guys know that you could become one of those? Maybe points up to an oak tree. Might even be the same tree that they fell from. And sort of conceptually, that's the whole idea of an acorn, if you sort of try to define it. Like when I sort of got into what it looks like, and maybe if we were acorns, how we would self-identify. But most people, if they're asked like, well, what's the purpose of an acorn? What does it do? Does it always look like that? Does it change? And of course, the story is that it becomes an oak tree. And the Buddha sort of uses a similar concept to demonstrate that we're sort of stuck here thinking that we're acorns, having no idea what we can become. Like people might sort of hint at it, the Buddhist teachings hint at it, and it has these extraordinary claims of what we can achieve, you know, like completely overcoming suffering, completely being happy. And not only that, but it could be lasting happiness. Like the Buddha talks about all sorts of things. So that's sort of the equivalent of the oak tree, I guess. And so our job is to, you know, just kind of learn more about things and start developing habits that'll ripen into an oak tree. And I guess the analogy has other pieces too, that we can't just do it ourselves. You know, we need the right soil, we need water, sunlight, all these ingredients for it to work. But the job can be done. It's possible. And so maybe I'll stop here and see if there are any questions so far. So I think I've covered the first couple things. Well, actually, maybe just the first one, so I ought to speed up here. But So we've talked about sort of Buddhism and what does it mean to practice it? What's the goal? Any questions about that? Oh, okay. Well, just let me know if you think of one. And we'll probably break in about 15 minutes or so here. But I'll just kind of summarize the life of the historical Buddha for you. That sort of sets the stage pretty nicely, I think. So Shakyamuni Buddha, the person referred to as this historical Buddha, was born about 2,500 years ago, and was born into a really wealthy family as a prince. And one day, a spiritual seeker, like sort of like I think Siddhi or something might be the word for that. I can't remember, but like sort of in India at the time, someone who's just generally known as sort of a spiritual seeker as a profession. It was definitely considered more of a profession back then than it is now. Now it's sort of seen like more of a philosophy or a religion or something like that. It's definitely changed over the years. But anyway, this seeker went to Shakyamuni Buddha's parents and said, I've seen a vision, and your son will either be remarkably wealthy, successful, and inherit this kingdom and grow to be a great ruler, or will be a great spiritual seeker and accomplish a lot of success and understanding the goals of the spiritual seeker, answering the meaning of life, understanding more about reality, those kinds of things. So we can't fault the parents for this, but they hadn't heard about Buddhism yet, I guess. So they chose the wealth. So definitely the more tangible thing at the moment. So Shakyamuni Buddha ended up growing up in that kingdom. And not only did they choose that, but they tried everything they could to make sure that's the one of those two things that happened. And so they ended up sheltering him from a lot of the suffering in the world so that he wouldn't have to see that. The suffering wouldn't have to be contagious. He wouldn't have to ask the tough questions, that he could just live a simple life and be really happy. So, but one day, a group of friends convinced him to take a walk far enough from the palace that they sort of got outside the sphere of influence that his parents had and encountered 4 unusual things that he had never seen before. The first one being someone with an illness, a sick person. And so he asked his friends who were there, like, what's the deal with that? I've never seen anyone have this problem in the kingdom. So they explained what the concept of an illness is. And they said, yeah, this actually does happen. Not only does it happen outside the kingdom, but it happens to all of us at some point. And your parents have just been pretty adept at hiding you from that. But it actually does happen to all of us. And then he saw an old person and had never seen a person that old at the kingdom. Apparently they sort of scuttled the older people off to a different part of the kingdom, so Shakyamuni Buddha didn't have to be stressed out about that. So they explained old age. And then they explained the concept, and then he ran across a corpse. So he had never seen a dead person before either. So again, his friends had to explain that concept, that we all actually die someday, and this is what it's like, that our body becomes ineffective. And then the fourth thing that he saw was he met a spiritual seeker, the same kind that had actually given that prophecy when he was born. And he listened to him for a little while and found it kind of interesting and thought, well, actually, I think my whole idea of the world is kind of ruined here with these 3 realizations. And I think I got some work to do here figuring these things out. I'd like to learn more about them because in particular, he resonated with the teachings about benefiting others and compassion. And that's just not a thing he really grew up with a lot of examples for in the kingdom and with the way he grew up. And so he was sort of inspired to do that and realized maybe it's a little selfish to keep on growing up here and become the king. And maybe there's more I can do. So maybe I should try this. And so he ended up becoming a spiritual seeker himself and ended up sort of going to the opposite end of the spectrum and practicing asceticism. I think am I pronouncing that right? That's basically the word for a lifestyle where you sort of try to learn the answers that you're seeking as a spiritual seeker. What's the meaning of things? Try to learn those answers by just sort of separating yourself from everything. So, you isolate yourself, go out into the wilderness, abandon nice clothes, just keep the ones that you're on. Keep the clothes that are on your body. Don't bother changing them. And stop eating food, drinking, you name it. They sort of just live a minimal lifestyle. And it is true that there are a lot of people in that time that did accomplish some realizations at that time through living that way. And there are some things apparently, I guess, you learn only in those conditions, that it's very difficult to learn without going through that. I guess that makes sense. I think if someone goes through all that, then, we all probably have our own examples of how hardship ended up being the thing that had to teach us a lesson. But then someone approached him. There was a woman in the village where he was doing this, or nearby, and offered him a bowl of rice porridge. And he had a thought at that time, like, well, okay, I guess I've been doing this long enough. I can't remember how long. I think maybe a few years, 6 years maybe, that he was practicing this lifestyle. And he decided to accept this bowl of rice, thinking, well, okay, I think I've given that a try enough. That's probably not the answer either. And so that's sort of where the concept of the middle way comes from. And I think probably the middle way means other things as well. But that's sort of one of the first definitions that we tend to encounter for that. The idea that we should try to avoid straying too far in either of those directions, either having such an indulgent lifestyle that you don't really need to think about your problems, and also don't be too hard on yourself. Don't force yourself to endure extremely difficult conditions just for the sake of it. That somewhere in the middle is the most productive way. So as you may know, part of this story is that he eventually sat down in a city called Bodh Gaya under a tree, a Bodhi tree, and made a determination to sit there until he finishes figuring this stuff out. Like apparently he had been touring around, learning from other spiritual seekers, having some debates, and decided, okay, I think it's time for me to really focus here. I think I'm onto something. And the legend is that he achieved full enlightenment under that tree. So, meaning that he had overcome his suffering entirely. He finally rooted out all those mistakes in his mind. And so his mind was at peace and definitely not boring. I often wondered sort of like the first few descriptions of enlightenment to me, I wasn't really sure if it was for me or not. Talking about like peace of mind and contentment, and not that those are bad things, but I guess for me personally, I didn't find that very exciting. But the more teachings I listened to, the more I heard people talk about the fact that no, that you can have peace of mind and contentment and also intense feelings of bliss and pleasure and what we might call excitement. Like those things are all still possible. And I've heard hints here and there that maybe excitement isn't really the end all be all. Like if we measure things according to that pleasure and excitement and those things, that one of the reasons which I was sort of, not really enamored with the description of enlightenment is because it didn't really correspond with mine, which was mistaken. So, or at least if we take the Buddha's teachings as a hypothesis, I'm definitely mistaken about that, the pleasure, the excitement. But anyway, the Buddha achieved those things, and not only that, but he was in a perfect position to help others. And they describe that as a big part of the Buddhist path as well. And they say that you don't have to wait until you're enlightened to do it. We can always practice wherever we are. We can benefit others in lots of different ways. Even if we're overcome by suffering ourselves, there are always ways we can find. But if we ask ourselves like, well, what's the best way? How can I become perfectly qualified? Then doing this job that Shakyamuni Buddha did is the path that Buddhism talks about. And so he started teaching. And getting more towards our first teaching now. We're getting there, and we'll talk about that after our break soon. But he ran across a group of people that he had actually done some of the extremist lifestyle with, like the depriving himself of food, like the asceticism lifestyle. He ran across a group of people that were doing that with him, and who had gotten judgmental when they saw him eat that bowl of rice, thinking he had sort of ruined it for everybody. Like he was the weakest link. How dare he? Like he ruined our solidarity. But he happened to run across them pretty early and told them a little bit about his path and how it ended up. And apparently, they all could just kind of see from his behavior and from the smile on his face. I don't know the specifics of this, but apparently he just kind of demonstrated all the results of this, and they fairly quickly decided to give it another chance, and they asked for some teachings from him. So I think that's probably a good time for a break. Anybody feel like a stretch break? Go out and maybe I think we have some water outside, right? Like the water cooler. Actually, I think is it straight outside the doors? Okay, and use the restrooms. So we'll come back in about 5 minutes or so. So about 8:01, 8:02. Also, feel free to have discussions or conversation if you'd like, or if you have some questions, feel free to ask them to the group while other people are taking a break. So, okay. Yeah, I think we'll get started in just a moment here. So make your way back to your seat if you'd like to join us for the second half. Any questions come up during the break? No? Okay. So now is the part where I'll get into some more terminology. And so for those of you who wanted to learn some of these terms, now we're going to get started on that finally. So I'm going to get more into the specifics of things. So, and we're in good shape on time. It looks like I only covered, what, 2 out of 6? But I think I couldn't resist jumping ahead a few times. And so we've covered at least half the territory so far. So we're in good shape there. Okay. So lineage, I guess we just covered a summary of who the Buddha was. We haven't finished with the Buddha because we're going to get to his first teaching and a couple concepts later. So I mentioned briefly the idea of lineage in terms of the teachers Lama Yeshe, Lama Zopa Rinpoche being sort of part of the lineage of this Buddhist center and organization, like the parent organization of other Buddhist centers. And the concept of a lineage in general describes the sort of like the passing of the wisdom of the teachings from teacher to student. And then when a student becomes a teacher, then they pass it along to their students. And then you have a chain when it gets long enough that if you have the right guidelines for passing it to the next person in that chain, then it can be preserved in a genuine way. And there are a lot of lineages in Buddhism that actually have these characteristics that have very high standards for the work on the mind that the teachers accomplish. And when they teach their students, then their teachers can help them figure out when they're qualified to pass it along to someone else. And it's not that we see this happening in a common way, people just kind of giving each other parts of the lineage. I think in reality, it's often said to be a fairly rare skill to actually pass it along in such a way that it doesn't really lose any genuine aspects. But we do talk about the lineage in the sense that if that fizzles out, then it would be very difficult for the concept of Buddhism to exist. Or maybe more generally, the concept of Dharma, which I don't think is a term we've mentioned before, but Dharma is maybe a little more general than the term Buddhism in the sense that Dharma is really any practice that helps you overcome suffering, or at least alleviate suffering. And so that's sort of the general definition of Dharma. And we'll learn in a moment in the discussion of the Buddha's first teaching that the word Dharma, when you capitalize the D in Buddhism in particular, kind of refers to the set of teachings of Buddhism, because, as we mentioned, that's the goal. That's the goal of these Buddhist teachings, is to overcome the suffering. So okay, so other figures in the lineage that we could talk about, in particular getting here towards Tibetan Buddhism. In the 1st century, there was a teacher named Master Nagarjuna, who apparently was really renowned in his teachings on what they call wisdom, which is seeing reality correctly. So that's sort of the word that you encounter a lot in Buddhism for accomplishing that goal of seeing reality just like it is. And in the 4th century, so about 300 years after that, Master Asanga, and I believe both of these practitioners were in India. So Master Asanga became renowned for his teachings on compassion. And I've kind of indirectly mentioned compassion when I talk about benefiting others. But to be precise about the term compassion, that really means to wish that someone can be free from suffering, or that yourself could be free from suffering. You could have self-compassion as well. So basically the sincere wish for that. And wisdom and compassion, so sort of the specialties of these two teachers are sometimes described as the two wings of a bird, in the sense that they're kind of the two main topics that we specialize in when we're studying Buddhism. And we aspire to sort of become as well-versed as possible with the concepts, and so that we can increase our wisdom and increase our compassion. And they say that increasing our wisdom, or in other words, seeing reality correctly, is what primarily helps us overcome our own suffering. We definitely need compassion to get there, because we need help on the way. But they say that that's the main result when you sort of perfect your practice of wisdom. And on the compassion side, that once you really finally develop compassion and get to the point where it just comes completely naturally to want to benefit others and to wish that they're free from suffering, to wish that they have the happiness, which, by the way, the term love usually means that one. The wish that someone's happy is referred to as love. And it's kind of it's very similar to compassion, of course. So compassion being freedom from suffering, and love wishing for the happiness. So, but once you get far enough into certain teachings, they start to distinguish even those two concepts from each other. And so perfecting both is becoming a Buddha. So we've talked about the Buddha, meaning the historical Buddha, Shakyamuni Buddha, the prince who grew up in the kingdom. But the concept of the Buddha is also used as well. And I think it's usually a small b when you use it this way, when you just sort of describe someone as a Buddha when they've accomplished both the wisdom and the compassion, like perfected both. And they say that for each one, once you really sort of root out all the mistakes and achieve perfect understanding of the wisdom or the compassion, then you're good to go. I think that's pretty cool, that there aren't many things in life that are guaranteed. But apparently they say, if you do the job, if you follow the Buddhist teachings all the way to the end and really perfect these two things, then you're good to go. You don't need to worry about falling back into the suffering. And you can spend all of your time and energy just benefiting others. And they say that once you have those two things developed, wisdom and compassion, then the natural byproduct of that is that that's exactly what you would want to do. Like once you see exactly how other people exist and you have a sincere wish for them to overcome suffering, then it just kind of happens automatically. And when someone's motivated that way, they can overcome any obstacles. So okay, so Nagarjuna with the wisdom and Asanga with the compassion. And there's a nice story about Asanga as well. So he's the one who lived in about the 4th century. And when he was near the completion of his perfection of the compassion and wisdom, they say that he meditated for about 12 years in a cave, which is often a traditional trajectory that you hear about in many Buddhist traditions, is like after learning the teachings and debating and things like that, that at some point, the most productive way to sort of get to the next level is to have quiet solitude and be able to really work in a subtle way with your mind. And so that's the stage that Nagarjuna, or that Asanga was at when he went up into the mountains, found the meditation cave, and decided to stay there and try to see if he can perfect the job. But he ended up trying for about 3 years until he reached the point where he sort of decided, I really don't know if this is a good idea. I just don't, I think this isn't the thing I should be doing now. I'm not doing the right thing, something. Maybe I find a different teacher. So he started to have doubts. So he left the cave and he was on his way back to the village. and looked up and saw an eagle. And the eagle was familiar to him because he saw the eagle sort of fly into a particular den where it was living. And he had noticed that it had gone back and forth so many times in this same den that the edges of the den, like the entrance to the den, had sort of worn into like a smooth opening. And he thought about the fact that, well, each time the eagle just brushes up against one of the sides there when it returns home. But apparently it's done this so many times, and as I've stepped out of my cave and seen that thing, yeah, it has become smoother. So that inspired him to go back to practice. So another 3 years. And then he gives up again. He makes progress, but there's more to be desired. He just doesn't think he's done yet. So, and at that point, he notices the dripping of some water, and realizes, oh yeah, that's been here the whole time. But for some reason, after the second period of 3 years, notices that, well, where the drips are falling, there's an indentation in the floor of this cave. And it's actually noticeable. I think when I came in here to this cave, it wasn't there before. So he's like, okay, I guess I forgot the lesson with the eagle. That's a good reminder. Okay, and another, I think it was 6 years in the last stint, if I remember the story right, that he tries again and makes a lot of progress, but again, just isn't satisfied. Still feels like there's a lot of work to do. So he decides to go seek a teacher. And so he looks in particular for his teacher, Maitreya, sort of his favorite teacher, and hoping he was still doing his thing and living in the village and that he was still available for teachings. And incidentally, Maitreya also is described as the next Buddha. So we haven't really gotten to the concept of reincarnation yet, and that's sort of necessary to even be able to imagine these kinds of things that they talk about. But it's said that Maitreya will be the next Buddha to become a historical Buddha. They say the historical Buddha that we talked about, Shakyamuni Buddha, isn't necessarily the only one. One of the other concepts that we'll talk about starting next week is the nature of the mind, including that it has no beginning and end. So if you sort of take reincarnation, at least as a hypothesis now, then there can be another time in which there's another historical Buddha. And Maitreya, the same teacher of this master of Sangha in the cave, who will become the next Buddha, they say. So he goes looking for him and has trouble finding him. And eventually, let's see, I forget exactly what the segue is to this, but at some point he just kind of gets desperate and is sort of willing to do anything to get over this obstacle that he's at, whatever it is. And in this state of mind, well, desperation probably isn't a good word, because I think probably at the stage he was at, that wouldn't be a thing. But maybe mild frustration, let's say. And he turns a corner and happens to see a dog who's kind of a mangy dog and had an infestation of maggots on his back, and is kind of looking back, trying to gnaw at it, scratch that itch, but the dog just wasn't able to do it. And so Asang was like, oh, geez, I'm glad I happened upon this dog. Maybe I could help. So he started picking off the maggots, but then realized, like, oh, wait, I don't think these maggots will survive if they don't have a food source. So what am I going to do with these? And he ended up attaching the maggots to himself and ended up just kind of, I think it was on his arm or something. I can't remember exactly what, but he ended up sort of one by one picking these maggots off the dog, putting them on his own arm. He started getting itchy and then an infestation, but started seeing the dog feel better. And that sort of inspired him to continue until every one of those maggots was gone. And he turned around to go on his way, and one decided to look back one last time, and the dog wasn't actually there, and instead was Maitreya, his teacher. So, and then Maitreya kind of laughed and said, "Yep, that was me. And I was also the eagle. And I was also the water dripping in your cave. So you probably didn't think that I was around, that there was anybody helping you. But we actually have been helping you all along." So that's the story of Asanga. And so that was 4th century. And in the 7th century, there was another one, Master Chandrakirti. And apparently he perfected the wisdom teachings, going beyond even what Nagarjuna taught at the time. And then we start to get into our Tibetan lineage here. We get to the 10th century, Lama Atisha, who's the statue here wearing the red hat. And so he was the original teacher who brought the Dharma, the Buddhist teachings, to Tibet in particular. And he designed what we call the Lam Rim. So there's another term for you. That's a word that means, Lam means path and Rim means stages. So it translates into the stages of the path. And so that was sort of Lama Atisha's style, that he took all the Buddhist teachings and organized them into a natural order, sort of beginner to advanced, and the topics that tend to be the most productive ordering to learn them in. And sort of gathered all the teachings in this. So it's sort of like a course. If we think of it like the K through 12, and then undergraduate university, graduate school, PhD, whatever, as a progression. Whereas a lot of Buddhist traditions at the time kind of jumped around to different teachings, all of which were great, but there was a problem developing that Atisha noticed, that people weren't really understanding the connection between these teachings, and they kind of end up feeling at a loss to sort of put it into practice. But Lama Atisha sort of helped by putting it in this natural ordering and sort of gathering it all together. And then apparently it started degrading again after Lama Atisha passed away, and the teacher wasn't there anymore teaching. And about 400 years later, Lama Tsongkhapa shows up, and Lama Tsongkhapa is let's see, I think he's over here on the right. Does that sound right to you? He's the one in the middle. Is that okay? Yeah, this center. So I don't know if the camera can see, but Lama Tsongkhapa here, that's the right one, right? I'm gonna make sure I get it right. So yeah, so Lama Tsongkhapa is here in the middle underneath Shakyamuni Buddha. And these two students flanking him are Lama Tsongkhapa's 2 main students. And so he came along and tried to fix some of the problems that were occurring at the time, and wrote some commentaries on the Lam Rim, which is what Lama Atisha provided. And the main form of the Lam Rim that Lama Atisha had written was 68 verses. So it was kind of short and dense. And I guess one of the reasons that people sort of started straying from the original intent. And so Lama Tsongkhapa wrote some commentaries on those 68 verses, and lots of different lengths. I think there are some commentaries that are actually a little shorter, other commentaries that are much longer, and sort of everything in between. And so that was Lama Tsongkhapa's contribution. And I think those are the only ones that we have statues of in this particular lineage. But it was said that like all these teachers I mentioned sort of were part of this lineage, going from the 1st century all the way to the 15th century. And Lama Tsongkhapa being the most recent that we have sort of standard texts that we would call like root texts. Ones that are sort of the go-to texts, sort of like the Bible would be in Christianity. And so Lama Tsongkhapa wrote one called Lam Rim Chenmo, and I forget what Chenmo means, but that was one of his longer commentaries, and it's 3 pretty big volumes. And I think we have it in the bookstore, at least sometimes we do. I think it's there to borrow or to purchase there. So that was the one that probably became the most well-known of the commentaries that he wrote on the Lam. And from there, the Tibetan Buddhism tradition thrived again. And somehow it made it all the way to 2026 here, that the teachings are still alive and well. I don't know whether or not we can point to specific teachers that we can add to this list. There are a lot of people who believe so. A lot of people point to the Dalai Lama as an example of someone at an incredibly high level, someone who's really finally developed their compassion and wisdom and is incredibly beneficial. So, but part of the problem is that the Buddhas don't go around announcing themselves all the time. The concept is that only the historical Buddha does that. So, not that he went around bragging, but at the very least, he did sort of, like go around and participate in teachings and, gather students. And he really sort of made it an active tradition. So after all this time later, it's said that this lineage manages to survive in the teachers that we have here. So there must be teachers alive who have the genuine teachings. If the teachings that they themselves give are accurate, and that's one of the things that they tend to say, that the teachings are still present and we can learn the genuine ones. And one of the reasons that we can is all these things around the altar here behind me. And what those are Tibetan scrolls, or I don't know if scroll is the right word. So each one of those, so there are cubby holes there. You see like 3 things in each cubby hole. And each one of those 3 things is sort of like a stack of long and skinny pieces of paper that have Tibetan writings on them. And they sort of read it like a book. Instead of turning pages side to side like we do, they sort of flip the pages in the Tibetan writings forward, back and forth. And all of these teachings together comprise, they say, 84,000 total individual teachings that Shakyamuni Buddha gave, and that were recorded over time. Apparently, they found enough people who were there for the teachings and found enough people to corroborate with each other, and they were able to record all of those teachings accurately. Kind of seems like a pretty big task, but that's how the story goes. And we're very fortunate, I think, to have a set of all 84,000 here. And Geshe Gelik often mentions that they provide a really great blessing for us, like just sort of being able to see them helps our mind in ways that we probably don't notice or understand, but that's one of the things that they say. And another thing about 84,000 is they say that the reason that Shakyamuni Buddha gave that many teachings is because there were that many kinds of students he came across, and that many personalities, that many types of mistakes that we make, and why we need the Buddhist teachings. So apparently there are 84,000 different mistakes we could make, which in one sense is kind of overwhelming to think about. But I think the flip side there is sort of the silver lining is that ultimately there are lots of teachings about how they all kind of condense down to this one that we call ignorance that I mentioned before. So we don't necessarily have to painstakingly one by one go through all these 84,000. So there are lots of paths, all the way on down to if we can somehow just overcome ignorance, then that's just one mistake that can help fix all the others. So I guess each of us has somewhere between 1 and 84,000 to go. Hard to say. And so now we get to the Buddha's first teaching, I think. Or maybe I'll take a short break to see if anyone has questions. Okay. So, yes, CJ.
You talked a little bit about the lineage. What is the name of the lineage?
Okay. Yeah, good question. She's
Like,
wondering what is
there
the
are
name of
different
the
names for
lineage?
different, like,
Okay. That's a good segue into the next topic of types of Buddhism, I think. The specific name of our lineage, I don't know if I'm gonna remember this right, but I think if you sort of follow all the branches and limbs and twigs and everything down to the specific type of Buddhism that we practice here at the center, and which is also the same type that the Dalai Lama practices, in general is under the umbrella Tibetan Buddhism. And under that, it's the Gelugpa tradition, like Gelugpa, I think. So there are four main divisions of Tibetan Buddhism that are still active today, Gelugpa being one of them. And I think if you go even farther than that, you can get into the different schools of thought that have different theories on exactly how the self exists, and this concept of emptiness and no self, and these things that we say go back to the root suffering and the root cause of ignorance. And so I think it's called Prasangika, Madhyamika Prasangika, or maybe the other way around. Prasangika Madhyamika Madhyamika. Okay, I'll look it up for next time. But I think, so Tibetan, Gelugpa, Prasangika, Madhyamika would be our lineage. I think that's as far as it's traced in terminology. So maybe zooming out a little bit, other than Tibetan Buddhism, there are other types of a similar Buddhism that they call Mahayana, Zen being the main one that's still practiced today. So Tibetan and Zen are still in one category, and that category is distinguished by having both of the wings of the bird, the wisdom and the compassion, as part of the goal. Like the teachings are designed to accomplish both of those goals, and sort of that's what you set out to do if you're practicing in that tradition. The other big of the really kind of the two main branches at the very top. So Mahayana is that one. And so that's the wisdom plus compassion sort of side. And on the other side, it's called Hinayana. And that one is more focused on the wisdom side. And so the main goal there is a focus on overcoming one's own individual suffering before proceeding. So, and there are lots of teachings on the fact that neither one's the better one, neither one's right or wrong or anything, neither one's more advanced than the other one. They're just simply two different traditions. And there's two of them because that's sort of a division of the types of personalities we have as well. And they say that a lot of people are just more attracted to the idea of focusing on one thing at a time and tackling wisdom and needing a lot of compassion to do it, but not actually having as a specific stated goal to perfect that compassion along with the wisdom. And the other side being the taking both sort of together. So Hinayana, Mahayana, and there's only one surviving tradition within the Hinayana. I think there were 18 to start out, and there's only one that's really active still in 2026, and it's called Theravada. And one of the main practices they have is Vipassana meditation, just in case you've heard that word. That's the traditional type of meditation if you hear people going to like 10-day hardcore meditation retreats, like sitting for most of the day in silence, just, doing very simple meditations, focusing on the breath. So that's one of the main, that's sort of one of the things that Theravada is known for, is that tradition of meditation, those 10-day retreats. And Zen Buddhism is more focused on, so over on the other side, on the Mahayana side, Zen Buddhism is probably focused more on, more sort of like the Vipassana way of doing things, like the more silent practices and sitting for longer periods and learning how to sort of alleviate the thoughts invading your mind, like sort of developing a feeling of contentment, like without any particular script, without really talking about a lot of the concepts in Buddhism, but more just sort of focusing on the sitting aspect of the practice. Whereas Tibetan sort of distinguishes itself by being a lot more about the concepts. It's sort of like the more academic oriented part of the tradition, but not academic in the sense of sort of just doing the theory, In fact, the word Kadampa and Kadampa Center, the name of this place, translates to putting the teachings into practice. So that's definitely a part of the Tibetan tradition too. The difference being that they have, instead of focusing on so much sitting, we definitely do meditation, and I promise we're going to do one. We'll do one at the very end today. In addition to doing meditation, we also have a lot of teachings about concepts, just like this very course. And we talk about things like, suffering and happiness and wisdom and compassion, and we'll get on to more terms like karma at some point soon. So the Tibetan tradition has a big focus on those things, and sort of dovetails that with the more sitting and concentrating side, in the sense that the idea is to sort of learn the concepts and practice them and debate them. And that's another great tradition, especially at the monasteries. There are very lively debates. I don't know if any of you have happened to travel to any of the monasteries where they do this. I think in India and Tibet, probably many other places they do this. But that's the place I've seen it, in India, where there are a bunch of monks standing out there kind of whipping their malas around and yelling at each other. And as a newcomer, if you hadn't been warned before, you might think they're in a fight. But actually, they're just very vigorously practicing debate on the Dharma topics. And it's a very different kind of debate that we might do in the West. And I learned the hard way when I took a debate class here at the center. And that was great. Maybe that'll happen sometime again. But they had a debate class here at Kadampa Center. And one of the main rules in Tibetan style Buddhist debate is that something's only correct if it can help you get to enlightenment. So they're not really interested in you participating in a debate by sort of using technicalities, by sort of dwelling on things that are definitely accurate, but not really relevant to someone achieving the goals stated out for wisdom and compassion, happiness, overcoming suffering. So growing up in a math and science type background, I was just so attached to those technicalities. I don't think I won a single practice debate. So yeah, we had good judges. I think Geshe Gelik was there to be a good enough judge that, yep, maybe someday. But that's just kind of one of the cool things I like about Tibetan Buddhist debate. So I have softened on the concept, and at least I guess I can say I'm not sort of opposed to it anymore. I'm definitely not good at the Tibetan rules, but so that's one of the things that distinguish Tibetan. And one analogy I remember too, sort of to distinguish these different traditions, is I think the analogy is usually mentioned in terms of like Zen Buddhism and Tibetan Buddhism, looking at them side by side. So if we take a silly analogy of sort of being in a car and having a snow globe with us. So we have a snow globe that we set up on the dashboard. Like, I think that's the right phrase for it. It's that thing that like, it's sort of like a globe with water in it and then little white flakes, and you shake it up and it looks like it's snowing. So we have that in the car with us. And the water in that globe is, let's let that represent our mind. So here we are driving a car around, and this snow globe is sort of like our mind. And so we notice our mind, since we're on driving a car, let's say we don't have a top-notch car, and we're not driving on completely perfect roads. So the snow globe on our dashboard is sort of jostling around. There's snow flying around through it. And the sort of part of the analogy of working on our minds would be to understand the water. And it's kind of difficult to understand the water when it's just got all this snow in it. And the Zen approach would be to find a nice smooth road, or maybe a better car, smoother surface, something so that globe can settle down. So when you're driving along, the snow will settle and you can finally see all the water, and really focus on that water and start to notice the properties like, oh, it's clear. Like, I didn't really notice because there was at least some snow there all the time. And it's very still. And that sort of gets to the sitting aspect that's emphasized in Zen. But I think someone practicing Tibetan Buddhism, what they would do, and I think it's Don Brown, by the way, who I originally heard this analogy from. So he's the lineage of this analogy for me. So a Tibetan would just go off-road have some fun, maybe see if you can take some shortcuts to wherever you're going. And that snow globe would be going crazy, probably bouncing around even in different parts of the car. But also from time to time, take a break when you do a rest stop. Take a look at that globe and see how the snow is moving. And over enough times, if you sort of look at it in different conditions, like the Tibetan Buddhist might look at it like, oh, so this is how it looks if I'm on a gravel road. This is how it looks if I'm taking a curve too fast. So they just kind of start to catalog all these things in their mind, observing like what the snow is doing in this globe. And eventually they end up understanding the water perfectly by simply indirectly watching the snow. So as cheesy as that is, that's my favorite analogy, I think. So we're the off-roaders here, I guess, in that analogy. So we're practicing the Tibetan Buddhist tradition where we're going to talk about a lot of concepts and definitely make use of the entire side that Zen focuses on too. And the idea in Tibetan Buddhism is each time you sort of reach a new understanding of something, then you can go into a meditation and think about it. Just kind of focus on that thing you just understood. They sometimes use the word realization to describe that. And that's basically something that has become habitual. Like, so if you understand something so deeply that you're never going to make that particular mistake again, and it's just sort of always there in your mind, you don't have to remember it. You don't have to train yourself anymore. Like you've gotten to the point where it's just completely second nature. So that's the mode in which you can accomplish that. And so Tibetan Buddhism is sort of going back and forth with practicing the analytical side and also involving some more silent concentration-based meditation where you can sit with the understanding or even just the feeling of the understanding and familiarize yourself with that. And that helps you get the understanding even deeper. Okay. So the Four Noble Truths. So we have two concepts left here. The Buddhist first teaching, which is the Four Noble Truths, and we'll do a meditation at the end. So when the Buddha met that group of people who had sort of dissed him after he ate the rice, in that part of his story, the first teaching he gave to them was in 4 parts, and it's called the Four Noble Truths. And the word noble in that phrase simply refers to the kind of person who would realize these truths. And noble, kind of a funny word in our times, but sort of a traditional word to denote someone who's highly realized in their wisdom and compassion. So someone is noble in their practice of Dharma and their accomplishments with their mind would observe 4 particular things that sort of summarize this condition of suffering that we have. The first one being life has suffering. So that's it. That's the first of the 4. Fairly simple, that acknowledging that suffering definitely exists. That's not really too hard for us to believe at first. So I think we got that first one down. The second one is that suffering has particular causes. Like it's not just random. It doesn't, change as the world changes. There's kind of a fundamental nature to this suffering and things that tend to cause it and causes that we can understand if we work hard enough. So that's the second truth. So there's suffering and it has causes. And the third truth would be that we can overcome all this suffering. So once we understand the causes perfectly, then we can completely overcome suffering. And they often use the word cessation in this third noble truth. You might hear that word. So meaning the cessation of suffering, the ending of suffering. So suffering exists, that's one. There are causes, and we can overcome that suffering. So the fourth truth is the method on how we actually accomplish that. So that's kind of probably the most complex of those 4 truths. And I think you mentioned the Noble Eightfold Path, if I remember right. And I forgot your name, I'm sorry. But what was your name again? Chris. Oh, someone mentioned the noble evil. Oh, I think it was Allison. Yes. Okay. Allison and Chafin. So yeah, so the fourth noble truth in its general form is often referred to as the eightfold path, sometimes the noble eightfold path. And if you look it up on Wikipedia, that's probably what you'll see in association with the four noble truths. And that has 8 branches, which I can't remember. So I won't try to recite them all. I think there's some point at which it's going to be actually part of this course, so we'll get there. But the Tibetan tradition tends to group those 8 into 3 categories. And they sort of group them into morality, concentration, and wisdom. And those are sort of, or actually, there's that, and then there's, I might be getting my things of 3 mixed up. So I can probably come back to confirm this week, but there's next week. There's morality, concentration, and wisdom being the 3 main practices, and also renunciation, bodhicitta, and emptiness. Does anybody happen to remember which is which? Have I remembered them correctly? Actually, I can probably find it here somewhere. Maybe during our meditation, I'll try to sneak a peek at and see which one is the correct one. But I believe the second set of 3 is what they call the 3 principal aspects of the path. And the morality, concentration, and wisdom, I believe they often, is that the 3 trainings, I think? Actually, I probably shouldn't speculate. I'll get back to you on that one. But the fourth noble truth, we can at least refer to as this eightfold path. So in this, there's a medical analogy here in which if we look at the first noble truth, then we can think of the suffering that it refers to as like an illness if we get sick. And the second noble truth is about asking like, whoa, what happened here? What disease do I have and how did I get it? So if you start asking those kinds of questions, that's getting at the second noble truth of the cause of the suffering. The third noble truth, that you can overcome it completely, would be about what can actually accomplish that, which in this analogy is medicine. So ultimately, it's the medicine in our Western tradition that can cure diseases. And also maybe grouped along with that would be a doctor who can give you that medicine or prescribe the medicine. But the fourth noble truth is where you sort of get into exactly how you take the medicine and, you know, the dosage, the times of day, what else you should do with the medicine, whether you should eat before it or eat after it, those kinds of things. And in that practice of taking the medicine effectively, the Buddha would be the doctor, the one who prescribed the medicine. So that's like giving the teachings. And the medicine itself would be the teachings. The word dharma is usually referred to here to represent it. So the Buddha being the doctor, the dharma, or the teachings, being the medicine. And the third prong, the third pillar of that treatment plan would be the nurses, who are there for troubleshooting, you know, helping you with the medicine. And when things go wrong, they're the ones who are right there at hand to be the first line of defense. The ones we go to for advice. And so the word Sangha is usually the word that's referred to there. And Sangha can sort of mean multiple things. On the conventional level, it sort of refers to the people around us who really help us practice, like who help guide us, give us advice, answer our questions. You know, when things go wrong, we can, you know, get some guidance from them. Sort of ultimately, though, going beyond the conventional level, Sangha is sort of specifically defined as the realization of all the teachings in someone's mind and such a person being there to help you. So in other words, like somebody who actually is part of the lineage, the authentic lineage of these teachings, and has realized all of them. And somewhere in between those two is referring to Sangha as like monks and nuns, people who have taken ordination. Okay. So any questions about the Four Noble Truths? So we're on our last topic then of meditation. And so I'll save the last 5 minutes or so to do a meditation, but just sort of to briefly talk about the concept. There are two general types of meditation, being concentration or focus. Sometimes what's grouped into that is also awareness and visualization. So those are all sort of in a family that has something in common, which is to have a focus on something and to try to, eliminate distractions and remember the object of your focus as well as possible. The other type of meditation is referred to as analytical, and sort of a regular language way of saying that is thinking about things. So analytical is a little fancier word than we need, I think. It's just to sit down and think about something. And often there is something specific that you're encouraged to think about. It really can be anything. By definition, an analytical meditation is when you just sort of get an environment that's conducive to thinking. Sometimes it could be exactly the same spot, like if you're sitting cross-legged, like some of us, or on a chair. We can do either a concentration meditation or an analytical meditation in that posture. But either way, it's conducive to either thinking or focusing. And there are often some scripts that are sort of common things to think about. And we'll get to a couple of those in this course. One of them, for example, being a script for understanding the concept of precious human rebirth. So that's sort of a phrase that means like one of the things that they encourage us to start with at the fairly beginning of this path. That's the Lamrim, like the graded path to enlightenment that Lama Atisha brought us and Lama Tsongkhapa provided the commentaries on. So if we follow that path, then we will pretty early on try to cultivate an appreciation for being a human. And it goes into the reasons. And Tibetans love to have lists of things. So there are like 8 things that we have that we can appreciate, and 8 things we are free from that we can appreciate. So there's a meditation that sort of goes through those. I think there might be 10. I think there's 8 of one, 10 of another. We go through these 18 or so things and just think about each one. And if we manage to sort of reach a point where we actually feel sort of a sense of appreciation, like it might be the first time we've ever really felt it at a certain level, like, wow, it actually is kind of useful to be human, and I can see the advantages and why that might be a good thing if I'm setting out to overcome suffering and accomplish happiness. So analytical meditation often has, specific things that you're encouraged to go through in your analytical meditation with the idea to help you reach a certain understanding. Another one will be compassion. We'll encounter that later in the course. There's a script, actually 2 variations of a script that can help us understand compassion and habituate our minds with it better. And ultimately, the purpose of meditation is to familiarize ourselves with something. Because if you look at, you may have heard the word Gampa to refer to this room. That's usually, we say, go to the Gampa for the teachings, go to the Gampa for Geshe Gelek's teachings. The Gom part, the first part, Gom, means to familiarize. And I think it's Sanskrit, if I remember right. Might be Tibetan, but I'm pretty sure it's Sanskrit. But it translates in some language to just the simple concept of familiarization. And both of those types of meditations help us do that. And like the concentration type meditations help familiarize us with a focused mind, like, the habits we need to develop to help with our focus. And the analytical meditation will help familiarize ourselves with the concepts that are the most productive ones to guide our thinking, the most productive things to think about. So ultimately, it's just familiarizing ourselves more with things. Or as we have lots of examples already, like getting better at a sport or practicing it with a coach and getting better at piano. It's hard to overcome. It's hard to achieve perfect piano skills without some practice. Apparently, some people seem to be born with that. I've seen concerts by like 3 and 4-year-olds that are pretty amazing. But in general, with most skills, practice makes perfect. And a teacher is usually helpful with that as well. So, all right, I think let's talk about the meditation posture a little bit, and then we'll do a short meditation. So the posture usually has 7 parts. It's called the 7-point meditation posture. And we'll sort of do a simplified version of it. It can get into quite a lot of detail, but the entire purpose of this thing called the 7-point posture is just to help your body be comfortable while you're trying to meditate. And I think the long-term purpose of it is these 7 specific points help you accomplish being able to sit for a really long time. And so if you really get serious about the 7 points, like if you're able to, of course, we start out like, I feel like I can only meditate for 5 seconds at best. Like my mind's off in another direction before 5 seconds has passed. But if you're there long enough that you can actually, apparently it's possible to be in meditation for hours or days or even weeks. Like there are some people who have gotten such amazing focus that that's really not a problem for them. And just a tiny amount of food and water can sustain them for that long of a time in meditation with very minimal interruption. So we're not going to worry about that exact goal yet. But for us at this stage beginning, at least speaking for myself, we just simply want to do what's commonly thought to help our body be stable and comfortable. And depending on what kinds of malfunctions we have, like for me, there's no way I can sit in like the full pose in the 7 points because my legs should be crossed in a way that my feet are on top of my thighs. I can't. That's called lotus position. I can't do that. Sometimes I even just have to sit in a chair when my legs get too sore. But the goal is to whatever for your body is the most comfortable, go for that. And it looks like we're all either sitting cross-legged or in a chair. And that's great because those are the 2 sort of most common types of meditation postures that we talk about. So I'll cover both as we go through them. I think maybe we'll go ahead and combine them in one. Maybe as the first part of our meditation, I'll just sort of mention the points. And you can sort of think about that and maybe try to adjust that part of your body as I mention it. And then once we get through those 7 points, we're going to do what's called a scanning meditation. So we're going to practice some sensory focus with our body by thinking about different body parts and how they feel as we're meditating. Just simply observing different parts of our body and looking at it. And we can maybe talk a little bit more after the meditation or next week about why we might do that kind of meditation. But let's go ahead and get started here. We're down to about 5 minutes remaining here. Okay. So first of all, we can start by taking a couple deep breaths, which is not one of the 7 points quite yet, but is a very effective way of helping calm our mind. So it tends to help calm whatever anxiety we walked in here with, and also works with our body as well. Our body listens, like I think it's the vasovagal system. That will just sort of induce some physical calm when you do that. Okay, so just a couple deep breaths. Okay, and the first of the 7 points is the legs. And if you're sitting cross-legged, actually, you're probably in the right position for this already. If you really want to try the full position, you can try putting your feet on top of your thighs, but just regular cross-legged seated position is perfectly fine. If you're sitting in a chair, then it's good to kind of scoot a little bit forward so that you're not leaning on the back of the chair and your feet are roughly flat on the ground. Maybe the legs at roughly a right angle. So that you're kind of sitting on the front half of the chair. Still comfortable, but also not really relying on the back of the chair. Unless, of course, that's more comfortable, in which case, feel free to do that too. So our legs are either cross-legged or roughly at a right angle with feet flat on the floor and using the front part of the chair. Try to help your back. So number 2 would be the back, help it be as straight as possible. And there's no need to be rigid with it. But it often helps if you can sort of imagine that you can tie a string to the top of your head and pull it upwards and help stretch your spine. And just kind of imagine your head moving upwards and your spine just kind of naturally expanding a little bit to relax. And then you would maintain that position in the meditation. A third point we can talk about is the shoulders and arms. So let the shoulders relax and hold the arms at your side with a little bit of a gap between your arms and your torso if possible to help with the airflow. And then that sort of goes right into point number 4, which is the hands. So your hands are in your lap with your left hand on the bottom with palm facing up, and then your right hand on top of the left hand, also with palm facing up. So you're sort of sitting with your 2 hands in the center of your lap, kind of cupped together with each other with the left hand on the bottom, the right hand on the top, which symbolizes the left hand with wisdom and the right hand with compassion, being an example of compassion rooted in wisdom. So that's sort of what that posture symbolizes. And number 5 would be the jaw and mouth. So relax the jaw so it's not completely slack, but also not with your teeth clenched. Lips slightly touching. And number 6 would be the tongue sort of gently touching the roof of your mouth and resting against like the back of your teeth. And that part with your tongue is meant to help with being able to sit longer without drooling. And finally, the head and the eyes will be pointed slightly downward, with the eyes either partially open or partially closed, whichever one feels more comfortable to you. Okay, so we'll just do the first part of the scanning meditation here, which starts by focusing on the air moving in and out of your nostrils and the rising and falling of your abdomen. And if you notice your mind drifting away to other thoughts, that's fine. The practice is to just simply bring it back to our chosen object of focus, which for now is the sensation of the breath, whether it's in your nostrils or your abdomen. And let's sort of briefly go through the body parts here. kind of start at the top of your body, at the top of your head. Notice any sensations in your head, like maybe if it's itching a little bit, perhaps after I mentioned it, maybe it'll start itching. Sorry for that. Maybe you can feel the hair on your head, actually. Maybe not something we think about very often, but see if you can sort of feel the sensation that there's hair there. And then moving down a little bit to check whether our head is naturally pointed very slightly downward. And our neck and back are fairly straight, not rigid, but kind of expanded enough to be comfortable and stable. Our arms are relaxed as well, with hands in the lap. And the legs. It's quite possible that your legs are already uncomfortable, in which case that's fine. Just kind of notice and think about that sensation. Okay, so now you can bring your focus back to the breath for just a couple deep breaths to end the meditation here. And one last thought before we bring our focus back to the room would be what we might call a dedication. So it's sort of the flip side of the motivation that we started with. So when you talked about the reasons that brought you to Buddhism, or brought you to the center, or reasons you came to the class, you might just kind of check in briefly to see whether some of those goals were accomplished, whether it might seem like a step in a productive direction. And one of the teachings in Buddhism is that anything we do like this that requires effort, we certainly probably experience things like boredom and discomfort, anxiety, whatever it was during these teachings, but you stuck with it anyway. And you gave up whatever you otherwise could be doing with the evening. And if your purpose is grounding in some way and helping to understand your mind better, overcome suffering, to be a happier person, to be more beneficial to others, certainly the teachings that we've been talking about today are in that direction. So making this effort, we can then decide how we'd like the positive energy that's generated from this to ripen. And the traditional way to do that is to sort of make an aspiration that with all the incredible benefit, and the teachings definitely say the benefit is huge, like bigger than we can possibly imagine, even just for these 2 hours of practicing different ways of thinking, checking in with our minds. This is incredibly powerful, and we can have some control over how that affects us in the future. And if we make a sincere wish for that to help us in a certain direction, then that'll make that more likely. So if we have a good sense of the direction, then definitely recall that. And if you want to practice expanding that to the traditional one we talked about earlier, try to think about how whatever your goals are, whatever purpose you would like this positive energy to be a part of, may also make the aspiration that it'll help you overcome suffering. and be a happier person with more peace of mind, and eventually help others do the same thing and be of benefit to others even as you're on the way. Okay, you bring your focus back to the room now. And my apologies for taking us 6 or 7 minutes over the time. So I'm happy to take some more questions, but that officially concludes our session. And next week, we will get more into some of the things underlying the Four Noble Truths. And hope you guys have a great rest of the evening. If you want to stick around for a few minutes, you're more than welcome to. Happy to chat some more. But thank you so much for coming.
All right. All right. Thank you, John. If anyone does have a burning question, feel free to go ahead and unmute and ask it. Otherwise, I ask you to just hold it until next week when I think everyone can benefit from the answer more than likely. So thank you again, everyone. Hope to see you next week, same time.